we're kind of leading this critical move in our discipline called something like rethinking theory from the periphery, from the margins. So since before I arrived here as a PhD student, I was already involved in the project that led to this school. I became a PhD student here in 2007 and 2009 with some of my dear colleagues. I had the opportunity to sit in a course. I think maybe it was a very paradigmatic one because it was a postgraduate course on IPS and the problem of the international, given by both Didier Bigot and Rob Walker. Since then, I have accompanied and witnessed João, who really has been leading critical studies in IR and certainly IPS here in IE and in Brazil. And from here, trying to engage as many of us students, former students, and now, strangely for me, colleagues, to learn more about critical approaches to IR, critical thinking in general, IPS most dearly. So for me, is this ambiguous place where I continue to be his supervisee, now colleague, former student, meeting again so many of you that have been here doing MAs, PhDs, but also in the IPS winter school for these last 10 years, amazing 10 years. So very nervous here, but also very emotional and thankful for so many of you, and most especially, of course, our team, Claudia and many of the girls here. I will keep for later all the thanking to do, but also, of course, our dear guest professor, Kai, Jan, Sophie, and now William, without whom we could never conceive the project and much less doing it for 10 years, especially in a place with huge challenges like Brazil. But most importantly, I think we would never conceive this without the students. So as I think I always kind of supported, and the social events, I think, is something that I'm really keen. I think building the community and the networks are hugely central to our work in the school. So thanks to you guys that are here, that travel to Rio again, or for the first time. Please be most welcome, and I hope you have, a great two-week winter school. And I thank most especially tonight William for his keynote speech. So thank you very much. Welcome. I hope you enjoy, and I hope you have 10 more years.
Thank you, Pedro. Yeah. Yeah, it's good that you reminded me that I should thank my good friend Jeff Parsons, who's been without most this year. This year's a lot of what we're doing this year wouldn't be possible. So it was key in obtaining funding for this year's edition of the Winter School, and he's been here since 2015, actually. Yeah, too. So yeah, sorry, Jeff. Just said that. And of course, for all guests. Faculty who come here voluntarily, guys, okay? They give their work, their labor freely for 2 weeks. So that's a big deal. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker of tonight. William Walters is a professor of international political sociology, in the Department of Political Science, and also the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. So he held an FPA Research Excellence Chair from 2009 to 2022. Originally, William was trained in chemistry at Imperial College London. He later completed graduate studies in politics at City University of New York and York University in Toronto. His research spans from political sociology, political geography, citizenship studies, security and insecurity, and Foucault studies. Over the years, he has explored diverse topics such as unemployment, the supranational governance of Europe, migration, and more recently, secrecy. A unifying thread in his work is the critical interrogation of taken for granted categories and experiences, and their relationship to political forms. He is currently engaged in 3 major projects: an SSHRC-funded collaborative study in air deportation, examining the role of civil aviation in the forced removal of foreigners and illegalized people in and from Europe, the co-editing of a handbook on governmentality that's come out already, actually, with Martina Tozzioli, and a book project titled Secrecy, A Critical Introduction. So once again, thanks, William. The topic of this talk tonight, this inaugural keynote speech tonight, is Society Must Be Defended, Michel Foucault and Project 2025. Thank you, William, for being here.
Yeah. This on? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Joao, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to have this opportunity. Over the years, I had several friends, colleagues, even a former postdoc who come to IPS winter/summer schools. I've always been envious, and I'm delighted that I had this opportunity. And to be here for the 10-year anniversary as well is really nice. So my title changed it a little bit. As you can see, Of Spirited Struggles, Revisiting Society Must Be Defended in an Age of Right-Wing Populism. I'm going to try to aim for about 40 to 45 minutes and leave time for your questions and comments. So this April, I took part in a panel on governmentality at a conference in Seattle. And a fellow panelist was presenting on the question of whether one can usefully speak about a populist governmentality. And in conversation with him afterwards, I admitted that I wasn't sure that governmentality would be all that helpful. And so I said, why not revisit the lectures Foucault delivered just before he hit upon governmentality? Why not look at the 1975 to 1976 series called Society Must Be Defended? After all, in those lectures, we find Foucault speaking about war, race struggle, class conflict, historical feuds, resentments, societies divided into rival camps, and in the final lectures, the final lecture that's most well known, state racism, biopolitics, and genocide. It seems to me, I said to the colleague, there's something about the tenor of those lectures that might have a political and emotional resonance with our own very fractious times. That is, the resonance with a time when in the US, immigration raids are conducted by masked government officials who snatch people without due process, disappear them into the black holes of detention and deportation. A time when in Florida, recently, a county sheriff could openly boast that if anyone protesting these deportations so much as threw a brick in the direction of the police, they would be summarily killed. So I don't know if my colleague followed up on the suggestion to revisit Society Must Be Defended, which I'm going to abbreviate to SMD for this evening. But I resolved that I should, and that this would be a good venue for such an exercise. So the timing is good, it's almost 5 decades since Foucault delivered these lectures. And I think Rio is a good place. As Marcelo Hoffman points out in his recent book, Foucault in Brazil, it was in Rio that Foucault first aired the concept of biopolitics in public. And as you'll all know, Foucault made a number of teaching trips to Brazil. And this included a lecture series here at PUC, where in 1973 he presented on truth and juridical forms. So PUC is therefore very much a part of Foucault's intellectual geography. Now, there's no doubt that, I have a slide of the book. There's no doubt that SMD has made a significant impact in international political sociology, security studies, and the social sciences more generally. And I think this had something to do with its timing. It appeared in French in 1997, and then in English in 2003. And so its circulation and its reception overlapped with the events of 9/11, the war on terrorism, the US-led invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and debates over liberal peace. And I think this is one reason that scholars were quick to pick up on its questions of state racism, sovereign power, making live, and letting die. And these are the sort of themes that these lectures are most famous for. But although it generated considerable interest, I don't think SMD has enjoyed the same influence as the governmentality lectures. So the main aim of this lecture is to revisit SMD and read it in light of the current circumstances of rising right-wing populism, trends towards illiberal democracy in many Western and non-Western countries, and especially America's authoritarian turn under Trump. That said, I'm mindful that depending on where you live, authoritarian populism or indeed other forms of populism may not appear all that novel. And this point was well made in an interview that Martina Tazzioli and I did in the handbook that João mentioned during the pandemic with Partha Chatterjee, who offered us what I would call a deflationary perspective on populism. He stressed that in electoral democracies in Asia, Africa, and India, populist parties and leaders have been around for more than half a century and developed relatively stable forms of competitive electoral populism. So I think any discussion of populism in Western countries has to proceed bearing in mind this fact that in popular politics in most of the world, as Chatterjee calls it, populism is not all that new. So I think it's about provincializing Western panics over populism. And so in my mind, that's something I try to keep in mind as I do this presentation. So my argument is this. SMD was taken up very unevenly in IPS and security studies. Scholars seized on the final lecture with its topic of state racism and biopower, but often skipped over the earlier lectures, and 8 of 11, in fact, where Foucault studies early modern chroniclers of what he calls race struggle or war of races. And he focuses mostly on early modern history in France and England. And these are histories and legends that vibrate with cries of blood, valor, glory, grievance, loss, and betrayal. So drawing on these lectures in particular, I propose a concept of spirited struggles, which I argue can be fruitfully brought into conversation with the partisan climate of politics today. It's often said that Foucault offers us a toolkit of analytics of power, such as discipline, police, pastoral power, biopower, and so on. And I think that spirited struggle expands our repertoire of forms of power in a way that better equips it for the present. I think it's especially useful, potentially, since it can contribute to a genealogy of politics, an enterprise that, compared with genealogies of governance, I would argue remains rather underdeveloped in Foucauldian-influenced political sociology. So originally, as the original title suggested, I planned the lecture to include a close reading of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, and in particular, its mandate for leadership. This is the 900-page document that The Nation magazine describes as the right's vast and chilling program for a second Trump term. Bringing together proposals, plans, and political fantasies from across the conservative movement, it's received intense media coverage, and a number of its architects, such as Russell Bout, the self-described Christian nationalist, are now in Trump's government. I didn't make as much progress as I'd hoped, though, with this 900-page document. So it'll weave in and out of my remarks, illuminating certain points, but I can't promise the close reading that I'd originally envisaged. So the lecture proceeds in three parts. First, a quick sketch of society must be defended, paying particular attention to the neglected lectures on race struggles. Second, some critical reflections on society must be defended at 50. You know, what do we think about it now, looking back? And then third, a section where I developed the idea of spirited struggles, in close conversation with Project 2025 and various writings on outside movements. There I showed that spirited struggles functions a little bit what Jeff and Claudia Arado might call a transversal concept. I use it to illuminate aspects of far-right politics, but I also suggest it can speak to other political scenes, such as certain indigenous people's struggles as well. And in a conclusion, then, I return to the theme of genealogies of politics as something distinct but related to genealogies of governance. So first section then, from the discourse of race struggle to biopower. Society must be defended begins with Foucault asking, what is power? Foucault entirely rejects the idea of a general theory of power in favor of a focus on, and here's his quote, the various apparatuses that operate at various levels of society. And I sometimes think if one was trying to visualize this idea of apparatuses, the dynamic sculptures of the Swiss artist Jean Tengelou are a nice visualization. You know, he sort of gives you things are cobbled together. There are sort of machines within machines, bits connected up in strange ways. There's nothing kind of symmetrical about it. Not all the bits work. We don't always know what the bits are for. So it's a very different way. It would be a very different way of visualizing systems of power than the more sort of symmetrical and sometimes neatly architectural views of politics that we get. For example, the famous political systems images from the 1950s and 60s associated with Parsons and David Easton and so on. Anyway, that's just an aside. So at the outset of Society Must Be Defended, Foucault explains the lectures will theorize relations of power in terms of conflict, confrontation, and war. And this is what Mariana Valverde, a particularly astute reader of Foucault, has called Foucault's Nietzschean proposal to see peace and civil order not as a default state of affairs, so much as an arrangement that is the resultant of battles, conquests, subordinations, chance, and betrayal. War and enmity lurk just below the calm surface, or what seems like a calm surface of social order. So to develop this argument, Foucault proceeds not as the philosopher might, interrogating concepts and values directly, but by means of his own distinctive archaeological and genealogical methods. Foucault looks to what he calls the excavation of subjugated knowledges. And when we hear that term, we perhaps think of the suppressed experience of the poor. But in society, which it could be in other contexts, but in Society Must Be Defended, the subjugated knowledges are not the missing voices and memories of the poor. Instead, they are the chronicles written by nobles, elites, and other actors who found themselves on the wrong side of history, whose race had been subordinated and mostly assimilated into what became the dominant nation or society, whose wealth and status was dissipated by the rise of absolutist monarchs and centralizing states. So Foucault heralds these chronicles as the first historico-political discourses, and sometimes he calls them counter-histories, since their aim is not the glorification of state and sovereignty, which is what a lot of history was doing, you know, glorifying the monarch, rationalizing it, legitimizing it, but instead it's the production of a form of counter-memory that decenters and destabilizes official narrative. So in other words, Foucault sees that these particular nobles are already kind of doing genealogies. He sees himself, he sees himself in them in some ways, even though he's not a noble. So above all, these counter histories show that sovereign law and civil peace is founded not on rationality or consensus, as Hobbes and his contract theories and other contract theories might have it, but violent conquest, subordination, treachery, lies, and betrayal. So I think before proceeding, it's crucial to recognize and point out that the race of these race struggles is different from modern ideas of race. As it appears in these counter histories, race is more like a sign of distinction, a line of descent, a pedigree. So Foucault doesn't claim this is the only archaic concept of race. There are others, but it does allow him to cast modern racisms in a new light. It also allows him to foreground the kind of inversion or reversal that's a mark of Nietzschean genealogies. So in the 1600s, race was a sign of distinction that elite families would have proudly affirmed. The common folk, at least in Europe at this time, would not have been considered a race. So we have a twist, because today many politicians and elites, certainly if they are white, would not want to consider themselves as a race. They'd be wary of race talk. They certainly would deny or refute the accusation that they were racist. So even Trump, despite all the terrible things he says, I'm not a racist. And there's a very nice paper by Alana Lentin, sociologist, called Not Racism. It's about a particular discourse. I don't like immigrants, etc., but I'm not racist. And I'll come back to this sort of theme of not racism or anti-racism a little bit later. So Foucault's lectures on Boulain-Villiers are typical of how he discusses race struggles, as David Macy, the translator of the lectures, has explained. And Gabriel Henri Bernard Marquis de Boulain-Villiers, to give him his full aristocratic title, you can see he's a fine-looking chap, was a French nobleman and scholar who submitted a huge report on the state of France to Louis XIV in 1727. And Boulain-Villiers was resentful of the way that the standing of the aristocracy was being marginalized by the centralizing monarchy. So as Foucault describes it, Boulain-Villiers will employ history as a weapon to support the cause of regaining lost rights and privileges. And to do this, Boulain-Villiers will seek to ground those rights and privileges in the past. I quote Macy here. In that past, the history of France becomes a race struggle between Germanic Franks, these are the ancestors of the nobility, according to Boulain-Villiers, and the Gallo-Romans, who preside over an illegitimate monarch. So it's a move of sort of appealing to a mythical past, identifying yourself with a particular race that you claim, once enjoyed these privileges and liberties that have now been taken away. So it's this sort of looking backwards, mourning the kind of loss of your kind of status, your being, your people. That is this sort of refrain that I'm following through across history in this presentation. And you can see it repeated in different places. Foucault talks a lot about in England, how you had this sort of discursive play between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons. So excavating the discourse of race struggle gives Foucault a way to bring historical heft and colour to his Nietzschean perspective. It's a focus that also gives him a way to convey the novelty of the formations of power that take shape in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century, namely the rise of biopower. I think Foucault's thinking on biopower and state racism is far better known, and I'll be very brief here. In fact, Foucault is very brief. His writing on biopower consists of this one essay at the end of these lectures and another chapter within the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Yet, it's been taken up and been hugely influential and critiqued. So what is biopower? By the 19th century, European states acquire new technologies and sciences that enable them to positively shape the health and longevity of their subjects. They're increasingly constituted and regarded not just as a flock, sheep to be led, or a nation, community to be kind of gathered and celebrated and affirmed, but as a population. And Foucault calls this arrangement biopower, giving a neologism then to this moment when states acquire a power over and through the vital life of their people. But biopower has an underside as well. With biopower, population comes to be seen more like a human as species, rather than society being a space populated by discrete races who joust and clash, and they might literally joust, but other times coexist. There emerges the idea of sub-races, enemies of the race, people whose very existence biologically threatens the latter's vitality. So Foucault sees these biologized ideas of race as first developing with colonization, or in other words, with colonizing genocide, as he puts it, but it will function on and within the domestic populations of European states too. And this leads to his famous remark, modern racism is primarily a way of introducing a break into the domain of life that is under power's control, the break between what must live and what must die. So that's a brief sketch of biopower and thinking about it in relationship to these, this idea of the race struggles. What can we say about society must be defended at 50 years on, 5 decades? First, what was Foucault's agenda here? Why, in particular, this interest in these otherwise obscure and archaic counter-histories? Why spend all this time on these nobles who've been sort of wiped out of the historical record or story? And some have argued that Foucault's doing a genealogy of racism here. Others have objected that if this is a genealogy of racism, it's woefully incomplete and Eurocentric, since it's largely intra-European in its sources. How can Foucault say so little about European colonialism in formulating this idea? Mariana Valverde counters that that may be so, but a genealogy of racism isn't really his objective in these lectures. Instead, the focus is on these counter-histories of race struggle as a way to decenter sovereignty. What I would add to these debates, and I'll be very brief on this point, is that I think he's also engaged in a discussion or a dispute with Marxism, both the Marxism of the 1970s that you would have encountered in its Western intellectuals, people like Althusser, Polantzas, but also the Marxism of the official Marxism of state communism. So Foucault's taking up with the Marxists, he's not that he's rejecting Marxism so much as relativizing, putting it in its place, you might say. He's very cautious of any attempt to treat Marxism as a science. It's as though he's saying to the Marxists, look, this thing called class struggle that you raise up, that you want to make the central object of your science, is actually not a thread that runs through all history. Rather, it's a particular story about society that was born under very specific contingent and unlikely historical conditions to serve particular ends. And in fact, it was born as race struggle rather than class struggle. So I think he's saying perhaps race is not as marginal to class struggle as you suppose, you Marxists, for whom race was just not a part of their theory in the 1970s and 80s. In other words, with Foucault, we're going from a general theory of class struggle to a genealogy of class struggle. So the second point about the lectures at 50. I think the take-up of SMD has been very uneven in IPS and security studies. There's been comparatively little interest in the race struggle lectures. And I think this is one reason I'm interested in revisiting them. By contrast, scholarly interest in themes of biopower and state racism has been huge and continues to grow in diverse areas that include topics like border violence, counterterrorism, surveillance regimes, and much else. If I have a criticism of this biopower-centered research agenda, it's not its focus or its claims, but its blind spots. And I think sometimes Foucault, there's a sort of Foucault effect here. Sometimes Foucault's concepts exert a kind of strong gravitational pull, drawing scholars into their orbit and eclipsing the possibility of exploring other worlds. And I wrote about this in my 2012 book called Governmentality, Critical Encounters. So state racism or biopolitical racism, and the terms are often used interchangeably, is one such case. So yes, biopolitical racism remains rampant today and mutates and takes new forms. But I think there are other things going on too, things that we miss if we start with biopolitical racism or biopower, then go looking for cases. I think that's the wrong way around. So for example, why not bring archaeological and genealogical methods to bear on other areas of critical race research? For example, where are the genealogies of anti-racism? Is anti-racism this rhetoric of reaction, to borrow a term from the political economist Albert Hirschman? Is this not one of the more fiendish and elusive forms that racism takes, at least on the political right, when, as Nandita Sharma puts it, from the 1950s onward, racism becomes increasingly unacceptable in mainstream politics? So, for example, in Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership, one encounters multiple disparaging references to critical race theory and gender ideology. These are said to be, quote, noxious tenets being imposed on school curricula by woke culture warriors. These doctrines, it said, teach children to see the world in terms of certain races that are superior or inferior, and that the color of their skin fundamentally determines their identity. In other words, for the architects of Project 2025, who profess a colorblind outlook, America does not have a problem of structural racism. What it has is a problem of woke elites, a new enemy within, who in the name of professing to counteract and remedy problems of racism, become the racists themselves. And it's one more inversion then in racism's long, ignoble history. I think that for anyone interested in this sort of genealogy, or where would you start with a sort of genealogy of anti-racism, a good place to start is David Goldberg's very recent book, The War on Critical Race Theory, which sort of focuses on the guy on the right, Christopher Rufo, who's the sort of right-wing policy intellectual who kind of first brands and coins critical race theory and kind of weaponizes it, turns it into a sort of campaign, a weapon to get at the left and the Democrats. So Goldberg, there's a very nice way of sort of showing very close empirical material detail with kind of complicated history by which CRT goes from being a part of academic life that most people have never heard of, to becoming a sort of new kind of demon, to becoming a meme and a TikTok and all sorts of other things, or a campaign that's taken up in various school board struggles. Third sort of point about society must be defended at 50 in retrospect. I think we can compare it with other ways Foucault will theorize power and power relations, especially governmentality, which succeeds it. So in Discipline and Punish, he examines power on the scale of microphysics. Quite often it's power exercised through dense institutionalized milieu, like schools and prisons, and at the level of bodies. With Society Must Be Defended, he jumps scales. And here he's looking at war, or more accurately, legends of war, between subjects who are collective actors. He's conducting analyses mostly at the level of large-scale groupings. And it's quite striking that other than legendary and mythologized heroes or infamous rulers, individual subjects, or more accurately, subjectification, barely appears in Society Must Be Defended. It's kind of missing. So it seems that when we then go forward 2 years with governmentality, Foucault's hit upon an analytics that is capable of traversing and expanding these, we might call micro and macro scales, but he's doing it without reifying them as scales or structures. So governmentality is a flexible analytics then that will allow Foucault to integrate the analysis of subjects and subjectification with large-scale formations of power, such as states, whole societies, and indeed international state systems. And I think that governmentality will prove flexible in other ways too. Society Must Be Defended is kind of really singular in its Nietzschean focus on the animating and constitutive role of forces of blood, honour, conflict, resentment, and so on. Governmentality opens up entirely new dimensions, other ethoi, where power is not the clash of vital forces or the training of bodies. And I think most notable here is the prominence in security territory population of pastoral power and the question of the power of care. This makes for a much more multi-sided and heterogeneous account. The third section, from great struggles to spirited struggles. There's been massive scholarly interest, as I said, in state racialism and biopower. By contrast, the lectures on race struggles have been rather less utilised. I think it would be clumsy to propose any kind of, to say the least, direct line of application from the race struggles lectures to contemporary issues. But I do think these lectures offer valuable material to analyse contemporary struggles, in which race, nation, battle, nostalgia, friends and enemies play a very prominent role. So to make this connection, I fashion a concept loosely derived from the race struggle lectures, which I will call spirited struggles. So my idea of spirited struggles is indebted to the political economist Graham Thompson, who's one of the few scholars to recognise the utility of the race struggle lectures for contemporary politics. Thompson juxtaposes sovereign power, biopower, and what he calls spirited martial power. He says that if sovereign power has demos as its referent, and biopower has ethnos, or we might say bios, then what does spirited martial power have? It has credos, which we could gloss as the power of belief. And to quote Thompson, in a discursive sense, then, this conception of power is wrought from struggles formed in the context of blood, soil, and toil, heroic virtue, and legendary combat. It's a power that celebrates valour, endurance, and suffering. So Thompson uses spirited martial power to theorise fundamentalisms, both secular and religious, and the challenge that they have at different times posed to the sovereign and biopolitical order of territorial states. But I opt to speak of spirited struggles, making the martial element more contingent and variable. But I think when we look to the rise of the far right in the US and world politics at the moment, I argue it's useful to see spirited struggles as having two poles, the martial pole and the civic pole. Hence, one could argue that a movement like the Proud Boys, you see here some of them, does concretize the spirited martial power. This group, maybe we better call them an embittered brotherhood, was in the vanguard of the Capitol insurrection on January the 6th, 2021. Based on a careful study of the language used in their speeches and online activity, political scientist Candice Travis describes the movement like this, quote, Proud Boys weave a mythology of Westernness as European whiteness, stretching back to their American founding fathers and cultural values of freedom and equality maintained only by virtue of a hierarchy of blood, gender, and property. Proud Boys rhetorically create such enemies as the politically correct social justice warriors who conspire against their homeland and must be defeated not only for the Proud Boy cause, but also for some larger sense of cosmic justice. Members of the Proud Boys, as well as the supporters, see themselves as victims, not merely having lost something, but having that something taken away from them. But what they've got is their Fred Perry t-shirts. But what then of spirited civic power? When we turn to Project 2025, we see very little explicit talk of white nations or of taking up arms literally in defense of one's nation and its purported values. Yet many of these currents of binary struggle, elites and peoples, victory and defeat, glory and dishonor, loyalty and betrayal, communities and their fiendish enemies, perpetrators and victims, and especially this nostalgic quest to revive and retrieve a wounded nation based on a mythologized past. That's the again in MAGA. These are very palpable, as you see in this text that I've highlighted from the opening essay of Project 2025. You know, America is now divided between two opposing forces, woke revolutionaries and those who believe in the ideals of the American Revolution, so on. So in Project 2025, the hyper-masculinized martial energy manifested by the Proud Boys and similar groups has been somewhat tamed and sanitized. Not sanitized too much. Moreover, we see these themes being brought into conversation with a more technocratic realm of public policy and legal reform. So there's a kind of articulation going on here. In Project 2025, then, it's mostly the civic pole we encounter, spirited civic power. At the same time, in numerous places in the report, the martial pole is clearly signalled, sometimes quite overtly, at other times through rhetorical codes, linguistic nods, and dog whistles. So that line there towards the end of that quote about a fight for the soul of America and these sort of two camps. In this, you can find this in a 1992 famous speech by the evangelicist Pat Robertson. You know, it's the first, it's considered the beginning of the culture wars kind of speech. So there's a sort of intertextual thing going on as well. So the memory of Capitol Hill is an absent presence, shimmering with menace behind the text. Let me wrap up this discussion of spirited struggles with 2 points of elaboration. First, by no means are all struggles spirited struggles. One of the most valuable and I think distinctive features of Foucault, but perhaps not always sufficiently appreciated by those who read him with a structuralist eye, is his nominalism. So as Paul Venn has underscored, with Foucault there are no universals. Instead, everything has to be understood as becoming. There's no power in general, no state in general, no human in general. But there are patterns, repetitions, forms, family resemblances that we can identify across time and space. So the SMT lectures are not a study of struggle in general, but the birth and transformation of a particular historical politico-discourse of struggle, this backward-looking, nostalgic, you know, these were our ancestors, look what happened to them. We want to sort of retrieve, revive the liberties and freedoms and community that they enjoyed. We want to go back to that. And we hold this against you who dominate and subordinate us today. So if I speak of spirited struggles, it's not to propose a grand theory of struggle. We're not here following Carl Schmitt, who generalized that politics is a game of friends and enemies. Sometimes it is, but it can be many other things as well. It's a matter of being quite precise in developing analytics that allows us to make connections as well as distinctions. So let me give you a hypothetical example concerning what we might call the threshold or the becoming spirited of struggles. So when people organize and struggle to save a particular forest or wetland from the serpents from the advance of the pipeline, this is not automatically a spirited struggle. Perhaps their actions are conducted in the name of climate science or wildlife preservation, or perhaps they have properties backing onto the wetlands. It's a NIMBY struggle, you know, not in my backyard, thank you very much. But it can become a spirited struggle whenever the participants strive through their aesthetic, rhetorical, cultural, and perhaps spiritual practices, especially their mobilization of histories, written and oral, to convince a public or a law court that the land in question is special, that it embodies a certain spirit of place, that it is ancient, that it is the land of their ancestors, a land they only hold in trust, land that is an integral part of their being. Only then does the struggle over the wetland or forest become a spirited struggle. If some of the people struggling summon the memory of previous battles, acts of treachery, of treaties once signed with the Crown or the federal government, and then betrayed, of promises reneged, or if they deem it necessary to battle physically and spatially to protect this ancient place with its unique character, then we're in the territory of spirited martial power. But if other elements of the movement, while sharing this sense of spirit, this same responsibility towards their ancestors, but out of fear that martial tactics will alienate the support of mainstream society, or out of concern about the violent response that they might get from the police, or perhaps vigilantes, or for other reasons, if they struggle to suppress these more martial forces, then we're also at the same time in the presence of spirited civic power. And often I think the martial and the civic will incite one another. You'll have a kind of looping effect. Maybe you'll have feedback. You will note that this hypothetical case is not drawn from the political universe of the far right. My point is that spirit struggles are in no way the monopoly of the forces of conservatism and reaction. It's not just a story of Christian, Hindu, or Islamic fundamentalists, white nationalists, and terrorists. So just as Foucault's race struggles could be articulated by radical forces like in England, the diggers and the levellers, as well as by conservative nobles, and just as race struggle could morph into class struggle, in fact, for Foucault, the boundary is very blurred, then so are spirited struggles quite polymorphous and laboured. Spirited struggles reveals that movements of indigenous people and far-right populace might actually have some things in common. Second remark, perhaps it goes without saying that in speaking of spirited struggles, I want us to take spirit more seriously. I think it's not exaggerating to say that Foucault-influenced scholarship has a somewhat secular, this-worldly bias. Biopower, bureaucracy, panopticons, governing through risk and markets, the whole emphasis on statistics and other devices which make problems of government visible and calculable. Spirit speaks to questions of life in excess of bios. Concepts like disciplinary power, sovereign power, or nation as imagined community only get us so far when it comes to understanding how individuals or whole communities come to sacrifice their lives for a cause or a credos. And spirit can help it. In fact, I think a better account of spirit could explain how death comes to be constituted in the language of sacrifice in the first place. And there's this brief remark in the one part of the Project 2025 document that provides a nice illustration of this point, a point at which spirit makes contact with the everyday biopolitics of pandemic governments. How much risk mitigation is worth the price of shutting down churches on the holiest day of the Christian calendar and far beyond, as happened in 2020? What is the proper balance between lives saved versus souls saved? So clearly, in some currents of the American right, some things do trump biopower, no pun intended. Disease, infection, and possibly death are a price worth paying for saving souls. So I think we need a better account of spirit, and let's stress a better sociological account rather than a philosophical or spiritual account. It's not about bringing back Hegel. And all I have at the moment are a few possible suggestions, places to look to do that kind of work. I don't have the answer, whatever it means looking more at growing work in political theology, political sociologies of religious movements, Avery Gordon's excellent book on hauntology, or revisiting Foucault's brief interviews where he talks about political spirituality. These are all possible places one might start. So I have just one more page, then I'll wrap up. In conclusion, so nobody talks about the peace dividend today. No one talks about a shrinking world in which ineluctable forces of globalization are lessening or even erasing boundaries. No one talks about the end of history or the post-political. The mood has changed. We're in a different moment. We talk about rearming, realigning, realpolitik. So my journey for this lecture began with an intuition that the far right in many countries, the harsher tone in politics and international climate in which large-scale conflict looms again. This and much else means that it might be worth revisiting Foucault's lectures, Society Must Be Defended. There seemed to be a resonance between the discourse of race struggle that Foucault unearths in the chronicles written by bitter and disinherited nobles in the 1600s and 1700s, and the discourse of the far right in America today, and of populist nationalisms in many parts of the world. In both, we hear the depiction of societies divided into starkly opposed sides. In both, we hear talk of betrayals, deceptions, loyalties, treacheries. In both, the talk of stolen rights, stolen inheritance, battles lost, but also a dream of future battles to be won. In both, the invocation of a mythological past, of heroes and villains and wrongs to be righted. But as I proceeded, I realized you couldn't simply take Foucault's concept of race struggle and transpose it onto contemporary politics. Too much has changed, and besides, the reference to race invites too much confusion and misunderstanding. So what I've therefore proposed in the lecture is a reworking of the race struggle idea. I've reinscribed the concept of spirited struggle into the discursive space which Foucault and then Graham Thompson opened up. And I've suggested there are two poles for these struggles, the martial and the civic. And I think this move has several strengths or benefits. The first, it helps to correct for the downplaying or the invisibility of spirit in IPS today. And I stress that throughout, I use spirit as a placeholder. How to study spirit is not something I have had time to tackle. Second, the introduction of the martial civic pole of distinction allows us to trace the movement the recombinatory character of politics and governance. So the point is now well made that we should not see liberal governmentality, biopower, or sovereign power as standalone systems. To make sense of any struggle are mobilized not by social movements at some distance from the state, but by a governing party itself. Look no further than the tariffs, a completely misconceived, self-destructive economic policy, perhaps, but certainly an economic policy implemented by calculated bureaucratic technologies, which finds its justification in the restoration of a mythological, industrial, blue-collar, white America. But that neo-mercantilist governmentality meets spirit, meets the rust belt. And in that meeting, spirit gets its hands dirty. And I think maybe one of the lessons of society needs to be defended is that the hands were never clean. And so, you know, I end by giving a better glimpse of this painting from 1874 by an American called John Gast. It's quite a famous painting, kind of went viral amongst the settlers. You know, it was turned into lithographs and woodcuts, and it was